Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Whether it's dense forests, ruined settlements, or frozen wastelands, the setting will remain a key part of the storytelling, almost acting as a character itself. The harsh environment constantly tests survival, making every step forward feel earned. When it comes to the plot, the sequel is expected to pick up after the events of the first film, but not necessarily in a direct continuation. Instead, it may present a new conflict that ties back to the legend created previously. The gold that once symbolized survival could now represent something much bigger, perhaps a reason for others to hunt him down, or a trigger that pulls him back into a world he tried to escape. The story might explore the consequences of his past actions, showing that even someone who seems unstoppable cannot outrun the impact of what they've done. One of the most anticipated aspects of the sequel is its action sequences. The first film set a high standard with its brutal, realistic combat, avoiding over-the-top CGI and focusing on practical effects and grounded choreography. The sequel is expected to take this even further, delivering more intense, more creative, and more unpredictable action scenes. Each fight will likely feel personal, raw, and exhausting, emphasizing the physical toll on both the protagonist and his enemies. Another key element is the tone. Sisu stood out because it didn't try to be overly dramatic or emotional in a traditional sense. Instead, it relied on atmosphere, tension, and visual storytelling. The sequel is expected to maintain this approach, using silence, pacing, and carefully crafted visuals to create an immersive experience. Rather than explaining everything through dialogue, the film will likely continue to show rather than tell, allowing the audience to interpret the deeper meaning behind each moment. The brutal, gold-drenched world of survival is returning once again, and this time it's bigger, darker, and far more relentless. After the unexpected global impact of the first film, the sequel to Sisu is shaping up to push the limits of action storytelling even further. The original story introduced audiences to a silent yet unstoppable force of nature, a man who refused to die, no matter how impossible the odds became. Now, the sequel builds on that legend, expanding both the scale and the intensity while staying true to the raw, gritty tone that made the first film unforgettable. At the center of this story is once again the hardened war veteran, a man shaped by violence and survival, whose past refuses to stay buried. Unlike traditional action heroes, he doesn't rely on dialogue or flashy charisma. His presence alone carries weight, and every movement feels deliberate, calculated, and deadly. In the sequel, his character is expected to evolve beyond simple survival. This time, it's not just about staying alive. It's about confronting something deeper, something more personal, and possibly something that connects directly to his past. The cast surrounding him is also expected to expand, introducing new faces that bring fresh energy into the story. While the protagonist remains largely silent, the supporting characters will play a crucial role in shaping the narrative. Some will act as allies, drawn to his mysterious strength, while others will become enemies, driven by greed, revenge, or fear. The dynamic between these characters will likely add more emotional weight, giving the story layers beyond just action and violence. The world itself is also expected to grow. While the first film focused heavily on isolated, war-torn landscapes, the sequel may explore new environments, possibly expanding into more populated areas or introducing different terrains that challenge the protagonist in new ways. As for the release timeline, while exact details remain uncertain, the anticipation around the sequel continues to grow. Fans of the original film are eager to see how the story evolves, and the demand for more of this unique style of action storytelling is stronger than ever. The film is expected to follow a similar release strategy, targeting both theatrical audiences and streaming platforms, ensuring it reaches a wide global audience. The trailer, whenever it officially arrives, will play a major role in setting expectations. If it follows the style of the first film, viewers can expect a mix of slow, atmospheric shots combined with sudden bursts of intense action. The trailer will likely avoid revealing too much of the plot, instead focusing on tone, visuals, and the sheer presence of the protagonist. Even a few seconds of footage could be enough to remind audiences why this character became so iconic in the first place. What makes this sequel particularly exciting is the potential to deepen the mythology of its central character. The first film gave us just enough to understand him, but left many questions unanswered. The sequel has the opportunity to explore those unanswered questions, adding depth without losing the mystery that makes him so compelling. It's a delicate balance, but if done right, it could elevate the story beyond just a simple action film. As the story continues to unfold, one of the most interesting directions the sequel could take is exploring the psychological side of its protagonist. In the first film, he was almost presented as an unstoppable force, but beneath that exterior lies a human being shaped by trauma, war, and loss. The sequel could dive deeper into this aspect, showing glimpses of what drives him, what haunts him, and what keeps him moving forward despite everything. The enemies in this installment are also expected to be more complex and dangerous. Instead of just being obstacles, they could represent different aspects of the world he lives in: greed, power, corruption, and fear. Each antagonist might bring a unique challenge, forcing the protagonist to adapt and evolve. This not only keeps the action fresh, but also adds a layer of unpredictability to the story. Another possible direction is the introduction of a character who challenges the protagonist not physically, but emotionally or morally. Someone who forces him to question his choices, or who sees him not just as a legend, but as a man. This kind of interaction could add depth to the narrative, creating moments of tension that go beyond action. Visually, the sequel is expected to push boundaries even further. The cinematography will likely continue to focus on natural lighting, wide landscapes, and gritty textures, creating a raw and immersive atmosphere. Every frame will feel intentional, designed to pull the audience into the harsh reality of the story. The use of color, shadows, and contrast will play a major role in setting the tone, emphasizing both the beauty and brutality of the world. Sound design will also be a crucial element. The first film used sound in a very effective way, often letting silence build tension before breaking it with sudden, impactful moments. The sequel is expected to refine this approach, using sound not just to enhance action, but to tell the story itself. Every footstep, every breath, every distant echo will contribute to the overall experience. The pacing of the film will likely follow a similar structure, balancing slow, tension-filled moments with bursts of intense action. This contrast is what makes the experience so engaging, keeping the audience on edge without overwhelming them. The sequel will need to maintain this balance while also introducing new elements to keep things fresh. From a thematic perspective, the film could explore ideas of survival, legacy, and the cost of violence. The protagonist's journey might not just be about defeating enemies, but about understanding what it means to keep fighting in a world that constantly tries to break you. These themes, combined with the film's unique style, could make it stand out even more in the action genre. The anticipation for the trailer continues to build, as fans look forward to their first glimpse of what's to come. Even a short teaser could reveal the direction of the story, the tone, and the scale of the action. If it captures the same energy as the first film while hinting at something bigger, it could generate massive excitement. In terms of audience expectations, the sequel has a lot to live up to. The original film set a high bar, not just in terms of action, but in terms of originality and style. The sequel will need to deliver something that feels both familiar and new, expanding on what worked while taking risks to push the story forward. Ultimately, what makes Sisu 2 so intriguing is its commitment to a unique vision. It doesn't try to follow typical Hollywood formulas. Instead, it embraces its identity, focusing on atmosphere, character, and raw intensity. This is what sets it apart, and this is what fans are hoping to see again in the sequel. As the release approaches, more details will likely emerge, giving us a clearer picture of what to expect. But even now, the excitement is undeniable. The return of this silent warrior promises another unforgettable journey, filled with danger, tension, and relentless action. And if the sequel manages to capture even a fraction of what made the original so powerful, it could once again leave a lasting impact on audiences around the world, proving that sometimes the strongest stories are told not through words, but through sheer presence and unbreakable, while that the legend continues to grow. the sequel begins to lean into something even more powerful than action, the idea of myth versus reality. By this point, the protagonist is no longer just a man moving through a violent world. He has become something people talk about in whispers, a story passed between soldiers, mercenaries, and survivors. Some believe he cannot be killed. Others believe he isn't even human anymore. And that growing myth creates a dangerous ripple effect, because when fear spreads, it attracts those who want to challenge it. This is where the story can take a more intense turn. Instead of enemies underestimating him like before, the new threats may come fully prepared. They know who he is. They've heard the stories. And instead of fear stopping them, it motivates them. That shift alone changes the entire dynamic of the conflict. It's no longer about surprise or underestimation. It becomes a battle between calculated brutality and unstoppable will at the same time. The film can begin exploring the cost of becoming a legend. When a man is seen as unstoppable, he stops being treated like a human being. People stop seeing pain, exhaustion, or loss. They only see what he represents. That isolation can add a deeper emotional layer to the story, even without heavy dialogue. Small visual moments, like him pausing, observing, remembering, can carry a lot of weight. There's also the possibility that the sequel introduces a parallel character. Someone who mirrors the protagonist in certain ways, but represents a different path. Maybe another survivor shaped by war, but who chose control instead of isolation. Or someone who sees the chaos not as something to escape, but something to rule. This kind of character can create a powerful contrast, turning the conflict into something more meaningful than just survival. As the narrative builds, the stakes naturally become larger. Instead of just protecting himself or his resources, the protagonist might find himself pulled into a situation where others depend on him. Not because he wants to help, but because his presence alone shifts the balance. This adds tension because protecting others is very different from fighting alone. It forces decisions, sacrifices, and risks that weren't present before. Visually, this shift in stakes could be reflected through scale. Wider shots, more movement, and more layered environments. Instead of isolated encounters, we may see sequences where multiple elements are happening at once. Conflicts overlapping, environments reacting, chaos spreading. But even in larger moments, the film will likely maintain its grounded approach, avoiding unnecessary spectacle and keeping everything rooted in physical realism. Another important direction the sequel could explore is time, not necessarily through flashbacks, but through the sense of wear and progression. The protagonist doesn't reset after every fight. Every injury, every decision, every moment adds up. This accumulation can be shown through subtle changes, his movements becoming heavier, his reactions more calculated, his patience thinner. These details make the character feel real, even when his actions seem almost impossible. The idea of legacy also starts to play a stronger role here. If people are already telling stories about him, then what happens when those stories grow beyond the truth? What happens when others try to imitate him, or worse, misuse what he represents? This opens the door for conflicts that aren't just physical, but symbolic. He may find himself fighting not just enemies, but the consequences of his own legend. Sound and silence will continue to play a huge role in building tension. Moments where nothing happens can become just as intense as full action sequences. A quiet forest, distant footsteps, the sound of wind moving through ruins. These details create anticipation. And when action finally breaks that silence, it hits harder. This contrast is one of the defining strengths of the film's style, and the sequel will likely refine it even further. The trailer for Sisu 2 will likely hint at this evolution without giving too much away. Instead of focusing only on action, it may highlight the shift in tone, the growing myth, the rising stakes, the sense that this story is becoming something bigger. Short glimpses of new characters, unfamiliar locations, and more coordinated threats could signal that this is not just a continuation, but an escalation. One particularly interesting possibility is how the sequel handles its ending. Instead of simply closing the story, it could leave room for interpretation. Not necessarily setting up another sequel directly, but allowing the legend to continue beyond the screen. An ending that feels complete, yet open enough to let the audience imagine what comes next. That kind of conclusion can leave a lasting impact, especially for a character defined more by presence than words. Another layer that could be explored is morality. In a world shaped by war and survival, the line between right and wrong is often blurred. The protagonist doesn't fight for justice in a traditional sense. He fights because he must. But what happens when his actions affect others in unexpected ways? What happens when survival comes at a cost that can't be ignored? These questions can add depth without slowing down the pace. The environments themselves may also begin to tell more of the story. Instead of just being backdrops, they could reveal history, abandoned places, remnants of conflict, signs of past struggles. These visual clues can add context without needing explanation, allowing the audience to piece together the world on their own. It's a subtle form of storytelling, but very effective when done right. As anticipation continues to build, one thing remains clear. The sequel isn't just trying to repeat what worked before. It's aiming to expand, to evolve, and to challenge both the character and the audience. That's what makes it exciting. It's not just about more action, but about deeper impact. The balance between mystery and clarity will be crucial. Revealing too much about the protagonist could weaken the myth, but revealing too little could limit the emotional connection. Finding that balance is what will define how successful the sequel becomes. At its core, this story is still about survival. But survival doesn't always mean the same thing. Sometimes it means fighting. Sometimes it means enduring. And sometimes it means facing something you can't escape. The sequel has the opportunity to explore all of these meanings, turning a simple concept into something far more powerful. As the narrative pushes forward, the tension will continue to rise, the world will feel more dangerous, and the legend will grow even stronger. And by the time the story reaches its peak, it won't just be about whether the protagonist can survive. It will be about what his survival means. That's where the true strength of this sequel lies. Not just in its action, not just in its visuals, but in its ability to create a story that feels both raw and unforgettable. A story where every moment matters, every decision has weight, and every step forward comes at a cost. And if it delivers on that potential, this won't just be another sequel. It will be a continuation of something rare, a story that proves silence can be louder than words, and that sometimes the most powerful characters are the ones who say the least, but leave the biggest impact. As everything builds toward its final stretch, the sequel begins to feel less like a continuation and more like a transformation. The story no longer revolves only around survival in a physical sense. It becomes about endurance on every level. By now, the protagonist has faced enemies who fear him, enemies who hunt him, and enemies who try to understand him. But the most dangerous challenge may not come from any external force. It may come from the slow realization that even legends have limits. This is where the tension reaches its peak, not through louder explosions or bigger battles alone, but through the weight of everything that has come before. Every wound, every loss, every moment of silence starts to matter more. The audience isn't just watching action anymore. They're feeling the consequences of it. And that shift is what gives the story its final impact. The film may begin to slow down slightly in its final act, not to reduce intensity, but to sharpen it. Slower moments allow the audience to absorb what's at stake. A single look, a pause before action, the sound of wind moving through an empty space. These details create a kind of tension that doesn't rely on chaos, but on anticipation. It's the calm before something inevitable. At this stage, the idea of choice becomes central. Up until now, the protagonist has mostly reacted, surviving, adapting, pushing forward. But the final part of the story could force him to make a decision. Not just about what to do next, but about who he is and what he represents. Does he remain the silent force that people fear? Or does he become something else entirely? The enemies he faces in this final stretch are likely to reflect that internal conflict. They may not just challenge his strength, but his identity. Someone who understands his methods. Someone who knows how he thinks. This creates a confrontation that feels less like a simple fight and more like a collision of ideologies, two forces shaped by the same world, but driven by different purposes. Visually, this part of the film could be its most striking. The environments might feel emptier, colder, more symbolic. Open spaces that emphasize isolation. Shadows that feel heavier. Light that feels sharper. Every frame could carry a sense of finality, as if the world itself is holding its breath. The action, when it happens, will likely feel more focused and more meaningful. Instead of constant movement, each sequence could feel like a decisive step toward an outcome that cannot be avoided. Every strike, every movement, every moment of impact will carry weight, not just physically, but emotionally. One of the most powerful aspects of this final section could be how it handles silence. Not just as a stylistic choice, but as a narrative tool. Silence can represent exhaustion. It can represent clarity. It can represent the space between who the protagonist was and who he is about to become. In a film where words are already limited, this becomes even more important. The concept of legacy returns here in a stronger way. Throughout the story, we've seen how the legend has grown, how others have reacted to it, and how it has shaped the world around him. But now, the question becomes, what kind of legacy will remain? Is it one of fear, survival, resistance, or something more complicated? The ending of Sisu may second choose to avoid a completely clear resolution. Instead of tying everything together neatly, it could leave certain elements open, not in a confusing way, but in a way that respects the tone of the story. A final moment that feels complete emotionally, even if not every detail is explained. Perhaps the protagonist walks away once again, not because the fight is over forever, but because that's what he does. He endures, he survives, he continues. Or perhaps the ending takes a more unexpected turn, challenging everything the audience thought they understood about him. Either way, the impact will come from how it's executed, not just what happens. Another possibility is that the final scenes reflect back on the beginning, creating a sense of full circle. Not necessarily repeating events, but echoing themes, showing how far the character has come, even if he hasn't changed in obvious ways. Growth doesn't always mean becoming someone new. It can also mean fully becoming who you were meant to be. The sound design in these final moments could be especially important. Minimal music, subtle ambient sounds, and carefully placed audio cues can create an atmosphere that stays with the audience even after the film ends. It's not about overwhelming the senses, but about leaving a lasting impression. As the screen fades, what remains is not just the memory of action, but the feeling of the journey. A story that didn't rely on excessive dialogue or complicated exposition, but still managed to say something meaningful. That's the strength of this kind of storytelling. It trusts the audience to feel, to interpret, and to connect. From a broader perspective, the sequel has the opportunity to solidify its place as something more than just an action film. It can become a statement about resilience, about identity, and about the cost of becoming something larger than yourself. These themes, combined with its unique style, are what set it apart. The expectations surrounding the film are high, but they come from a place of genuine interest. Audiences aren't just looking for more of the same. They're looking for something that evolves, something that respects what came before while pushing forward. And based on everything we've explored, that seems to be exactly what this sequel is aiming for. In the end, what defines this story isn't just the violence or the survival. It's the presence of its central character. A man who says very little, but communicates everything through action, through stillness, through persistence. A character who doesn't need to explain himself to be understood. And that's why this sequel matters. Because in a world full of loud, fast, and overly complex stories, this one chooses a different path. A quieter path. A more focused path. One that proves you don't need constant noise to create something powerful. As the journey comes to a close, one thing becomes clear. The legend isn't just about what the protagonist has done. It's about what he represents. And that idea will continue long after the credits roll. Whether this is the end of his story or just another chapter, it leaves behind something that's hard to ignore. A reminder that sometimes, the strongest force isn't the one that speaks the loudest, but the one that refuses to stop. Even after what feels like a conclusion, the story of Sisu 2 refuses to completely settle. Instead of closing the door entirely, it leaves behind a lingering presence, something that continues to exist beyond the final frame. This is where the film can take on an almost reflective tone, allowing the audience to sit with everything they've witnessed and piece together what it all means. The aftermath of the events becomes just as important as the events themselves. What remains after conflict fades? What does the world look like once the chaos has passed, even temporarily? These are the kinds of questions that can quietly shape the final moments. We may see traces of destruction, silence replacing noise, emptiness where intensity once dominated. But within that emptiness, there is meaning. For the protagonist, the idea of ending may not exist in a traditional sense. His journey has never been about reaching a final destination. It's always been about continuing forward, no matter what stands in the way. That's what defines him. And in this part of the story, that identity becomes even clearer. He doesn't stop because the world becomes peaceful. He stops because there is nothing left in that moment that demands his movement. There's also a strong possibility that the film subtly shows how others are affected by his presence, even after he's gone. Small details, people reacting differently, environments feeling changed, silence carrying a different weight, can all hint at the impact he leaves behind. Without saying a word, the story can show that legends don't disappear, they evolve into something else. Another interesting layer in this continuation is the idea of perspective. Throughout the film, we've largely experienced the world through the lens of the protagonist. But what if, in these final moments, the perspective shifts slightly? What if we begin to see him the way others do, not as a man, but as something almost unreal? This shift can reinforce the myth without needing to explain it. The pacing here would likely become more controlled, more deliberate. Every moment feels stretched, not in a slow or boring way, but in a way that allows the audience to absorb the atmosphere. This kind of pacing creates a contrast with earlier sections, where tension came from unpredictability. Now, tension comes from reflection, from understanding what has already happened. Visually, the film may lean into simplicity. Fewer elements, cleaner frames, more focus on space and composition. This minimalism can be incredibly powerful, especially after a story filled with intensity. It gives the audience room to breathe, but also reminds them that the world is still harsh, still unforgiving. Sound design once again plays a major role. Instead of dramatic cues, we may hear natural sounds, wind, distant echoes, subtle environmental noise. These sounds ground the story, making everything feel real even in its most symbolic moments. Silence, once again, becomes a form of storytelling. One of the most compelling aspects of this continuation is how it handles ambiguity. Not everything needs to be answered. In fact, leaving certain questions open can make the story feel more authentic. Real life doesn't always provide clear resolutions, and this film seems to embrace that idea. The audience is trusted to interpret, to reflect, and to decide what the story means to them. There's also a sense that the protagonist himself may not fully understand his place in the world. He acts, he survives, he moves forward, but does he see himself as others do? Probably not. And that gap between perception and reality is what keeps the character grounded, even as his legend grows. Another possible direction in this part is the subtle introduction of continuity, hints that the world continues beyond him. New conflicts beginning, distant signs of change, or even small moments that suggest life moving forward. These details remind us that while his story is significant, it is still part of a larger world. The emotional weight of the film doesn't come from dramatic speeches or obvious moments. It comes from accumulation. From everything we've seen, everything we've felt, everything that has built up over time. By this point, the audience understands the character without needing explanation. And that understanding makes even the smallest moments feel meaningful. There's also a possibility that the film uses contrast to emphasize its themes. Light and dark, noise and silence, movement and stillness. These contrasts don't just create visual interest, they reinforce the emotional core of the story. They remind us that everything exists in balance, even in a world defined by conflict. As the narrative settles, the idea of identity becomes clearer. The protagonist is not defined by what he says or even what he does in isolation. He is defined by consistency, by the fact that no matter what changes around him, he continues. That persistence is what makes him memorable. It's what turns him into something more than just a character. The final moments may choose to focus on a single image or action, something simple, yet powerful. It could be him walking away once again, disappearing into the environment. Or it could be something more symbolic, an object, a place, a moment that represents everything the story has been building toward. Whatever it is, it will likely be understated, but impactful. From a storytelling perspective, this approach is risky. It doesn't rely on clear answers or dramatic closure. But that's also what makes it unique. It respects the tone of the film and stays true to its identity, rather than trying to fit into expectations. The audience, especially those who connected with the original film, will likely appreciate this kind of ending. It doesn't try to impress with complexity. It resonates through simplicity. It leaves space for thought, for discussion, for interpretation. In a way, this continuation reinforces everything that makes the story special. It doesn't change its core, it deepens it. It takes the same elements and pushes them further, exploring not just what happens, but what it means. And that's what ultimately defines the experience. Not just the action, not just the visuals, but the feeling that stays after it's over. A sense that you've witnessed something raw, something honest, something that doesn't try to be anything other than what it is. As everything fades, the legend remains, not as a fixed story, but as something that continues to exist in different forms. In memory, in interpretation, in the quiet spaces between moments. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the story was never meant to end in a traditional way. Maybe it was always meant to continue, not on screen, but in the minds of those who experienced it. Because some stories don't need a final chapter to feel complete. They just need to leave an impact strong enough that you carry them with you. And this one, without a doubt, does exactly that. By the time everything reaches its quietest point, the story of Sisu 2 feels less like something you simply watched and more like something you experienced. It doesn't end with noise or spectacle. It settles into something calmer, heavier, and far more lasting. The kind of ending that doesn't demand attention, but naturally stays in your mind long after it's over. What makes this final extension so powerful is how it leans into restraint. Instead of trying to deliver one last overwhelming moment, it allows the silence, the stillness, and the aftermath to carry the weight. At this point, the audience already understands everything they need to. The journey has done its work. Now it's about letting that journey exist without forcing a conclusion. The protagonist, as always, remains consistent. He doesn't suddenly change into someone new. He doesn't deliver a final speech or reveal hidden emotions in a conventional way. They've been tested, challenged, and reinforced through everything that has happened. The concept of legacy becomes less about how others see the protagonist and more about what remains after he moves on. Not in a physical sense, but in an emotional and symbolic one. The impact he leaves isn't something that can be easily measured. It exists in subtle ways, in changes that aren't always immediately visible. Another key element here is acceptance, not in a dramatic or explicit way, but in a quiet understanding. The protagonist doesn't need to resolve everything. He doesn't need to define his place in the world. He simply exists within it, moving forward as he always has. And that acceptance is what gives the ending its sense of peace, even within a harsh environment. The film avoids the temptation to over-explain. It trusts its audience. It allows them to sit with ambiguity, to find meaning in small details, to interpret the story in their own way. This kind of storytelling isn't always easy, but when done right, it creates a deeper connection. As the final moments unfold, there may be a single image or sequence that captures everything the film represents. Something simple, but powerful enough to carry the entire emotional weight of the story. It doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to feel true. From a broader perspective, this ending reinforces why the sequel matters. It doesn't just continue the story, it expands its meaning. It takes what worked in the original and pushes it further, not by making it bigger, but by making it deeper. The audience is left with a sense of completion, but not closure in the traditional sense. There's still space for imagination, for continuation, for the idea that the story doesn't truly end. And that's what makes it memorable. In a genre often defined by excess, this film chooses restraint. In a space where characters are often defined by what they say, this one is defined by what he does and what he doesn't say. That difference is what sets it apart. As everything fades, the feeling that remains is not just excitement, but respect. Respect for a story that stayed true to itself. Respect for a character who never needed to change to be understood. Respect for a style that values presence over explanation. And that's where the true strength of Sisu 2 lies. Not just in its action, not just in its visuals, but in its ability to create something that lingers. Something that stays with you, even when there's nothing left to see. Because in the end, the most powerful stories aren't the ones that tell you everything. They're the ones that leave just enough unsaid and trust you to feel the rest. Even after everything that has unfolded, there's still a sense that the story of Sisu 2 hasn't truly ended. It has simply shifted into something quieter, something more internal. By this point, the narrative no longer needs action to hold attention. It holds it through presence alone, through the feeling that what we've witnessed carries weight beyond the screen. This final extension leans fully into that idea. It doesn't try to add more events or escalate the conflict again. Instead, it focuses on what remains, emotionally, visually, and thematically. It allows the story to breathe in a way that very few films dare to. And in doing so, it creates a kind of stillness that feels earned, not empty. The protagonist, as always, remains at the center of this stillness. But now, he feels different, not because he has changed dramatically, but because the audience has changed in how they see him. At the beginning, he was a mystery. Then he became a force. Now, he exists as something in between, both human and myth, both grounded and larger than life. There's a quiet realization here that the legend surrounding him was never just about survival. It was about persistence, about the refusal to break, even when everything else does. And that idea carries a kind of universality that goes beyond the story itself. It's not just about one man, it's about a mindset. In these final moments, the world around him feels almost indifferent. The same harsh environment, the same unforgiving conditions, the same sense that nature and conflict will continue regardless of individual stories. And yet, within that indifference, his presence still matters. Not because it changes the world completely, but because it proves something, that endurance is possible. The film may choose to show this through subtle continuity. Perhaps distant movement in the background. Perhaps signs that life continues in small, unnoticed ways. These details reinforce the idea that while his story is significant, it is still part of a larger, ongoing world. Another layer that becomes clearer here is the idea of memory, not in a literal sense, but in how the audience carries the story forward. The film doesn't need to revisit past events explicitly. It trusts that those moments are already embedded in the viewer's mind, and that trust creates a stronger connection. Visually, this part could be defined by balance. Light and shadow existing together. Movement and stillness coexisting in the same frame. These contrasts don't feel forced. They feel natural, as if the world itself is settling into a kind of equilibrium after everything that has happened. Sound, once again, is minimal but meaningful. The absence of overwhelming audio allows smaller details to stand out. A distant echo, a subtle shift in atmosphere. These elements create a sense of space, reminding the audience that silence can carry just as much emotion as sound. One of the most powerful aspects of this final extension is how it respects the intelligence of its audience. It doesn't try to summarize its message. It doesn't try to define its themes in a single, clear statement. Instead, it leaves space for interpretation, for reflection, for personal connection. There's also a sense that the protagonist himself doesn't seek resolution. He doesn't need to understand everything. He doesn't need to define his purpose in clear terms. He simply continues, because that's what he does. And that simplicity is what makes him compelling. The idea of legacy, which has been present throughout the story, reaches its most subtle form here. It's no longer about how others see him or what they say about him. It's about what remains in the absence of his presence. The quiet impact, the unspoken influence, the way the world feels slightly different because he passed through it. Another possible direction in these final moments is a return to movement. Not dramatic, not urgent, just a simple continuation. A step forward, a shift in direction. Something that suggests the story isn't confined to what we've seen. It continues, even if we're no longer watching. This approach reinforces the film's core identity. It doesn't rely on closure to feel complete. It relies on consistency, on tone, on the strength of its atmosphere and character. And because of that, the ending feels natural rather than constructed. The audience, by now, has likely formed their own interpretation of what everything means. And that's exactly the point. The film doesn't need to tell them what to think. It provides the experience and trusts them to find their own meaning within it. From a broader perspective, this final part highlights what makes the sequel stand out. It doesn't try to outdo itself with bigger action or louder moments. It deepens what already exists. It refines its style. It leans into its strengths rather than abandoning them. And that decision is what gives it lasting power. Because while action can be exciting in the moment, atmosphere and meaning are what stay with the audience long after. As the final image fades, whether it's the protagonist moving forward, standing still, or disappearing into the environment, the feeling that remains is one of quiet impact. Not overwhelming, not forced, but steady and undeniable. It's the kind of ending that doesn't demand applause. It earns reflection, and in that reflection, the story continues. Not through sequels or extensions, but through memory. Through the way it changes how you see the character, the world, and even the idea of what an action story can be. Because in the end, Sisu 2 isn't just about what happens on screen. It's about what stays with you after everything else fades. At this point, the journey of Sisu 2 feels complete, yet intentionally unfinished in spirit. What makes this final extension so compelling is that it doesn't try to add anything new. It refines everything that has already been built. It takes the silence, the weight, the presence, and allows them to exist without interruption. This is where the film transitions from being a story into becoming a lasting impression. There's a quiet understanding now that the protagonist's path was never meant to be fully explained. Every step he took, every decision he made, was driven by something deeper than simple survival. And while the audience may never fully understand that internal drive, they don't need to. The consistency of his actions has already told us everything that matters. In these final moments, the world feels vast again. Not in a grand or overwhelming way, but in a subtle, almost humbling sense. The same landscapes that once felt like battlegrounds now feel like open spaces, endless, indifferent, yet strangely peaceful. This shift in perception is important because it reflects how the journey has changed not just the character, but the way we see his environment. The idea of movement returns, but it's no longer urgent. It's not about escaping or chasing. It's about continuing. A slow, deliberate step forward carries more meaning now than any fast-paced sequence from earlier. It represents endurance in its purest form, the willingness to keep going without needing a reason that can be easily explained. Another layer that becomes clear here is the idea of presence without recognition. The protagonist doesn't need acknowledgement. He doesn't need validation from others. His existence is enough. And that quiet confidence is what separates him from more traditional characters. He isn't defined by how others see him. He's defined by what he consistently does. There's also a strong sense that the story has moved beyond conflict. Not because conflict no longer exists, but because it's no longer the focus. The focus is now on what remains after conflict, on the stillness, the aftermath, the space where reflection happens. And in that space, the story finds its final strength. Visually, this part may emphasize openness, wide frames, minimal elements, and a focus on natural composition. These choices create a feeling of freedom, but also of isolation. It's a balance that reflects the character himself, free to move forward, but always alone in his journey. Sound continues to remain understated. The absence of dramatic scoring allows the environment to speak. The subtle sounds of nature, distant echoes, and quiet movement all contribute to a sense of realism that grounds the film, even in its most symbolic moments. One of the most powerful elements here is how the film handles time. There's no rush, no urgency, just a steady progression that mirrors the protagonist's own rhythm. This pacing allows the audience to fully absorb the final moments, to sit with them, to feel their weight. The concept of legacy, which has been evolving throughout the story, now feels almost intangible. It's not something that can be seen or measured. It exists in memory, in feeling, in the subtle ways the story lingers after it ends. And that kind of legacy is far more powerful than anything explicit. There's also a sense that the protagonist's journey doesn't need continuation in a traditional sense. Not because there isn't more to explore, but because what we've seen is enough. It feels complete in its own way, even without clear closure. And that's a rare achievement. The audience, by now, has likely formed a deep connection with the character, not through words or backstory, but through presence and consistency. That connection is what makes the ending resonate. It's not about what happens, it's about how it feels. Another subtle element, is the idea of balance. The film doesn't lean too heavily into emotion, nor does it avoid it entirely. It finds a middle ground where emotion exists naturally, without being forced. This balance is what gives the story its authenticity. As everything settles, the final impression becomes clear. This is not a story that needed to explain itself to be understood. It trusted its audience, respected its tone, and remained consistent from beginning to end. And because of that, it leaves a stronger impact. The protagonist, in his final appearance, doesn't need to do anything extraordinary. Simply existing within the frame is enough. His presence carries the weight of everything that came before, and that presence is what stays with the audience. There's also a quiet suggestion that the world will continue to change, to evolve, to create new stories. But his story will remain as a reference point, a reminder of what endurance looks like when stripped down to its purest form. The final moments may not offer answers, but they offer something more valuable: clarity of feeling. A sense that everything unfolded exactly as it needed to, even if not everything was explained. And that clarity is what makes the ending satisfying. As the screen fades for the last time, the silence that follows doesn't feel empty. It feels full of meaning, of reflection, of everything that the story chose not to say directly. And that's where the true power of Sisu 2 lies. Not in its scale, not in its action, but in its ability to stay with you, quietly, persistently, long after it's over. Because some stories don't end when the credits roll. They end when you stop thinking about them. And this one doesn't let go that easily. Even beyond what feels like the absolute end, the presence of Sisu 2 continues to linger in a way that few stories manage to achieve. It's no longer about scenes, sequences, or even the character moving through the world. It becomes something quieter, an afterimage that remains in the mind, slowly settling but never completely fading. At this stage, the narrative has already given everything it needed to give. What remains now is interpretation. The audience begins to revisit moments in their mind, not because the film forces them to, but because those moments carry a kind of weight that invites reflection. Small details that may have seemed simple at first begin to feel more meaningful when viewed from the distance of the ending. The protagonist, by now, exists almost entirely as a feeling rather than just a character. His actions, his silence, his persistence, all of it combines into something that's difficult to describe but easy to understand. He doesn't need a final scene to define him. He's already been defined by everything that came before. There's a strong sense that the story has reached a point where it no longer belongs entirely to the film itself. It transitions into something shared between the film and the viewer. Each person takes away something slightly different. Some may focus on the action, others on the atmosphere, others on the themes of endurance and identity. And that variety of interpretation is what gives the story its lasting power. The idea of silence, which has been present throughout, now becomes almost symbolic. It's no longer just a stylistic choice. It represents everything that the film chose not to say. It becomes a space where the audience can project their own thoughts, their own emotions, their own understanding of what the journey meant. Visually, even the memory of the film feels consistent with its tone. Wide, open spaces, harsh yet beautiful environments. A world that feels both empty and full at the same time. These images don't just disappear when the film ends. They stay, replaying quietly in the background of the viewer's mind. Another important aspect of this final extension is how it reinforces the idea that not all stories need to resolve every thread. Some threads are meant to remain open, not as loose ends, but as possibilities. They suggest that the world continues, that life goes on, that the story is part of something bigger. The protagonist's journey, in that sense, becomes timeless. It doesn't feel tied to a specific moment or place anymore. It becomes more universal, an example of resilience that can exist in different forms, in different contexts, beyond the film itself. There's also a quiet recognition that the film never tried to be something it wasn't. It didn't chase complexity for the sake of it. It didn't rely on heavy dialogue or exposition. It stayed true to its identity from beginning to end. And that consistency is what makes it feel complete, even without traditional closure. As the memory of the film settles, the emotional impact becomes clearer. It's not overwhelming or dramatic. It's steady. It's the kind of impact that grows over time rather than fading. The more you think about it, the more you begin to appreciate the choices it made. The concept of legacy, once again, becomes central, but now it exists entirely within the audience. The story has done its part. What remains is how it's remembered, how it's discussed, how it influences the way viewers see similar stories in the future. There's also a subtle sense of respect that the film earns, not just for its action or visuals, but for its discipline, for its willingness to stay minimal, to trust its audience, to resist the urge to over-explain. That kind of restraint is rare, and it's what makes the experience feel unique. In a way, the final extension of the story is no longer about the protagonist at all. It's about the effect he leaves behind. The way his presence changes the tone of everything around him, even in absence. The way his silence speaks louder than words ever could. The audience, whether they realize it or not, becomes part of that legacy. By remembering, by reflecting, by carrying the story forward in their own way. And that's something no explicit ending can achieve. There's also a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the film didn't try to extend itself unnecessarily. It knew when to stop. It knew when it had said enough. And that awareness gives the ending a sense of confidence. As everything finally settles into stillness, the story reaches a kind of balance. Not a resolution in the traditional sense, but a feeling that everything is exactly where it needs to be. Nothing feels forced. Nothing feels incomplete. It simply exists. And that existence is enough. Because in the end, Sisu 2 isn't defined by its final scene. It's defined by the feeling it leaves behind. A feeling of persistence. A feeling of quiet strength. A feeling that even in the harshest conditions, something can endure. And long after the screen has gone dark, that feeling remains. Unchanged, unbroken, and impossible to ignore at the very end of everything. When the journey of Sisu 2 has fully settled into silence, what remains is not just a memory of events, but a presence that feels almost permanent. It's the kind of ending that doesn't try to hold your attention. It simply exists in your thoughts, returning quietly when you least expect it. Why now? The story has moved far beyond the need for explanation. Every action, every moment of stillness, every detail has already contributed to a complete experience. There's nothing left that needs to be added. And that's exactly what makes this final stage so powerful. It understands when to stop. The protagonist, who once felt like a mystery, then a force, and finally something almost symbolic, now exists in a space that doesn't require definition. He is no longer just part of a story. He represents something larger, an idea of endurance that doesn't rely on words or recognition. That transformation happens naturally, without the film ever needing to point it out directly. There's a quiet sense that the world continues exactly as it always has. The same harsh environments, the same unpredictable forces, the same constant movement of life. Nothing has fundamentally changed on the surface. And yet, everything feels slightly different, simply because of what we've witnessed. This subtle shift is what gives the ending its depth. It's not about changing the world, it's about changing perspective. The audience sees things differently now. They understand the weight behind small actions, the meaning behind silence, the strength behind persistence. The final moments may not show anything dramatic. In fact, they may show very little at all. A simple image, a quiet movement, or even just stillness. But within that simplicity lies everything the story has been building toward. It's not about spectacle, it's about meaning. Another important element here is the idea of closure without finality. The story feels complete, but not confined. It doesn't close itself off completely. Instead, it leaves space for the idea that things continue, even if we're no longer there to see them. That openness is what makes the ending feel alive. The use of silence, once again, becomes essential, not as a lack of content, but as a deliberate choice. Silence here represents understanding. It represents acceptance. It represents everything that doesn't need to be said because it has already been felt. Visually, the final impression remains consistent with everything that came before. Clean compositions, natural lighting, and an emphasis on space. These elements don't just create beauty, they create atmosphere. And that atmosphere is what stays with the audience. The concept of legacy now feels fully realized. It's no longer something the character carries. It's something the audience carries. The story has done its part. What remains is how it lives on in thought, in memory, in interpretation. There's also a sense of quiet confidence in how the film ends. It doesn't try to impress with complexity. It doesn't try to explain its themes in a final statement. It simply allows everything to settle naturally. And that confidence is what makes it feel complete. From a storytelling perspective, this kind of ending is rare. It requires trust in the audience, trust in the material, and trust in the idea that not everything needs to be spelled out. But when it works, it creates something far more impactful than a traditional conclusion. As the final image fades completely, there's a brief moment where nothing happens. No sound, no movement, just stillness. And in that stillness, the entire journey exists all at once. Every moment, every choice, every detail comes together, not as a sequence, but as a feeling. That feeling is what defines the story. Not the beginning, not the middle, not even the end, but the space it occupies in your mind after everything is over. And that's why Sisu 2 stands out. Because it doesn't rely on constant action or heavy dialogue to make an impact. It relies on presence, on tone, on the quiet strength of its central idea. It proves that a story can be powerful without being loud. That a character can be unforgettable without saying much at all. That an ending can feel complete without answering every question. In the end, what stays with you isn't just what happened, it's how it felt. A steady, unshaken sense of endurance. A quiet understanding of strength. A lasting impression that doesn't fade easily. And long after everything else disappears, that impression remains calm. Even after what feels like a complete and final ending, the essence of Sisu 2 continues to echo in a way that doesn't rely on visuals anymore. It exists purely as a feeling, something subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, but impossible to fully shake off. This is where the story transcends its own boundaries, moving beyond scenes and sequences into something more reflective, more personal. At this stage, the audience is no longer being guided. There are no cues, no structured progression, no clear direction. What remains is interpretation. Each viewer begins to reconstruct the experience in their own way, connecting different moments, finding meaning in different details, and ultimately shaping the story into something uniquely theirs. The protagonist, who has carried the weight of the entire journey, now feels almost distant, but not in a disconnected way. Instead, it feels as if he has become part of something larger than the narrative itself. He no longer needs to be present on screen to be understood. His identity has been fully established through action, through silence, through consistency. There's a quiet realization that his story was never about change in the traditional sense. He didn't evolve through words or emotional breakthroughs. He remained steady, unshaken, and that steadiness is what defines him. In a world constantly shifting and breaking, he is the constant. This idea of constancy becomes the core of the final impression. It's not something that demands attention, but something that quietly reinforces itself. The more you think about it, the more it becomes clear that his strength wasn't just physical. It was mental, almost philosophical. A refusal to give in, no matter the circumstances, the world around him, which once felt hostile and overwhelming, now feels almost neutral. Not because it has changed, but because our understanding of it has changed. We've seen it through his perspective, experienced its challenges, and now it feels familiar, even in its harshness. Another layer that emerges in this final extension is the idea of stillness as resolution. Instead of a clear endpoint, the story settles into a state where nothing more needs to happen. This stillness isn't empty. It's full of everything that has already occurred. It's the accumulation of the entire journey, condensed into a single feeling. There's also a sense that the story has reached a point where it no longer needs to prove anything. It doesn't need to justify its choices or explain its themes. It simply exists as it is, confident in its identity and its impact. The use of minimalism becomes even more apparent here. Every element, visual, auditory, narrative, has been stripped down to its essentials. What remains is pure storytelling, free from unnecessary distractions. And in that purity, the story finds its strength. The audience, by now, has likely formed a deep, almost instinctive understanding of the character. Not because they've been told who he is, but because they've seen it consistently. That kind of understanding is rare, and it's what makes the connection feel real. There's also a quiet acknowledgement that the story doesn't need continuation. Not because there isn't more to explore, but because what has been presented feels complete in its own way. It doesn't leave the audience wanting more in a traditional sense. It leaves them satisfied, yet thoughtful. The concept of legacy, which has been subtly building throughout, now exists entirely within the viewer. It's no longer something that belongs to the character or the world. It belongs to the experience. The way it's remembered, the way it's discussed, the way it lingers. Another interesting aspect is how the story handles time in retrospect. Looking back, the pacing feels intentional, every moment placed exactly where it needed to be. At this final stage, there is nothing left to expand, no new direction to introduce, and no additional layer that needs to be added. The story of Sisu 2 has already moved beyond structure and into memory, where it no longer behaves like a film, but like a lingering thought that resurfaces without warning. What remains now is not continuation, but residue, the emotional trace of everything that came before it. A kind of cinematic afterimage that doesn't fade cleanly, but slowly integrates itself into how the audience understands silence, endurance, and presence. The protagonist no longer feels like a figure confined to a screen. Instead, he becomes an idea that exists independently of the narrative, a symbol of persistence that doesn't ask for explanation or recognition. He is not remembered because he spoke or revealed something profound, but because he remained consistent in a world that refused consistency. This final reflection makes it clear that the strength of the story was never in escalation alone. It was in restraint, in the decision to avoid over-explaining, in the confidence to let actions carry meaning without translating them into words. That restraint is what gives the entire experience its weight. Now, even the concept of ending feels slightly unnecessary, because the story was never truly moving toward closure in a traditional sense. It was moving toward understanding, and that understanding has already been reached, not through exposition, but through accumulation. Every moment, every environment, every pause has contributed to a larger emotional structure that doesn't collapse when the story stops. Instead, it holds its shape in memory. That structure is what the audience carries forward. There is also a subtle realization that the world of the story was never separate from the audience's world. It reflected something familiar: struggle, persistence, isolation, and the quiet determination to continue despite uncertainty. That reflection is what creates connection, even in silence. The final impression is not dramatic. It does not demand attention. It simply exists, like something that has always been there, waiting to be noticed only after everything else has quieted down. And that is where the story finds its final form, not in resolution, but in permanence. Because some narratives are not meant to conclude in a way that feels final. They are meant to dissolve into thought, into reflection, into interpretation that continues long after the screen is gone. And Sisu 2 does exactly that. It doesn't end with closure. It ends with presence. And that presence, quiet and unshaken, remains, even when everything else has faded. At this stage of Sisu 2, the story begins to subtly shift its focus away from the individual and toward the consequences left behind in the world he has moved through. Even though the protagonist remains central in presence, the weight of his journey starts to reflect more on everything surrounding him: places, people, and the shifting balance of fear and survival. The environment itself begins to feel like it remembers, not in a supernatural way, but in the sense that destruction, conflict, and survival leave marks that cannot be ignored. Burned ground, abandoned paths, broken structures, these elements slowly build into a visual memory of everything that has happened. The world is no longer just a backdrop. It feels shaped by the events that pass through it. There is also a noticeable shift in how tension works at this point in the narrative. Earlier sections relied heavily on immediate danger, encounters, survival, and constant movement. But now, tension becomes quieter, more psychological. It exists in anticipation rather than action. The audience starts to feel that something could happen at any moment, even when nothing is happening at all. This change in rhythm is important because it reflects the evolution of the story itself. It's no longer just about surviving the moment. It's about surviving the aftermath of everything that has already occurred. That aftermath carries its own kind of pressure, one that doesn't disappear simply because the fighting slows down. The protagonist continues forward, but his presence now feels almost symbolic within the wider world. People who may never meet him still feel his influence indirectly, through rumors, through fear, through the visible consequences of past encounters. This creates a sense that the character has become larger than his physical role in the story. He is no longer just part of events. He is part of how those events are remembered. Another important layer in this section is the idea of distance. Not just physical distance, but emotional and narrative distance. The character feels increasingly separate from everything around him, not because he is changing, but because the world is reacting to him differently. That distance creates a quiet tension of its own, a feeling that he exists slightly outside the normal flow of things. At the same time, the film continues to resist explaining too much. There are no unnecessary clarifications or forced emotional dialogues. Instead, meaning is still carried through action, presence, and atmosphere. This keeps the storytelling consistent with its identity and prevents it from losing its minimalist strength. The tone of survival also evolves here. It is no longer raw and immediate like in earlier moments. Instead, it becomes almost philosophical in feeling. Survival is no longer just about staying alive in a physical sense. It becomes about continuing forward in a world that has already been permanently changed by what has happened. This is where the idea of endurance becomes more layered. It is not just physical endurance anymore. It is mental, emotional, and symbolic endurance. The ability to keep moving forward even when the meaning of movement itself becomes unclear. The world around the protagonist continues to adjust in subtle ways. Not through dramatic transformation, but through small, almost unnoticed shifts. Silence feels heavier in certain places. Empty spaces feel more meaningful. Even time feels like it is moving differently, as if everything is slowly settling after chaos. There is also a growing sense that the story is now being carried more by atmosphere than by events. Each frame, each moment of stillness, each environmental detail contributes to a larger emotional texture. This texture is what holds the audience's attention even when nothing explicit is happening. At this point in Sisu 2, the story begins to feel like it is operating on a different emotional frequency. The earlier intensity of survival and direct conflict has already settled into memory, and what remains now is a quieter, more reflective state where consequences take the front seat. The world no longer reacts loudly. Instead, it reacts slowly. Changes are subtle, almost imperceptible at first glance, but they build into something undeniable when viewed as a whole. Abandoned movement routes, shifting power dynamics in distant regions, and the way fear travels faster than information all contribute to a sense that the protagonist's journey has altered the environment in ways that cannot be undone. There is a growing realization that impact does not always announce itself. Sometimes it spreads quietly, through absence rather than presence. Places feel emptier not because something new has happened, but because something has already passed through and left its mark. The protagonist himself remains steady within this evolving landscape. He does not attempt to interpret the changes around him. He simply continues forward, as if interpretation is unnecessary. That restraint becomes part of his identity. He exists within consequences without needing to define them. This section of the narrative also deepens the idea of time as something flexible and subjective. Moments no longer feel measured by action alone. Instead, time feels shaped by stillness, by waiting, by the space between events. In that space, tension continues to exist, but it no longer depends on visible danger. It depends on expectation. The audience, by now, has become attuned to this rhythm. They understand that silence is not absence, but build-up. That stillness is not emptiness, but pressure. And that understanding creates a different kind of engagement, one that is internal rather than reactive. There is also a subtle exploration of perception. The protagonist is seen differently depending on where the perspective shifts. To some, he is a warning. To others, a myth. To others still, a distant story that feels almost unreal. These layered perceptions contribute to the growing complexity of his legend, even without any direct effort on his part. What makes this phase particularly powerful is that nothing needs to be explained for it to be understood. The film trusts its visual language. It trusts its pacing. It trusts the audience to recognize meaning without being told what to feel. The environment continues to act as a silent participant in the story, not as a passive background, but as something that reflects the emotional tone of the journey. Empty horizons feel heavier. Ruins feel more permanent. Even open space feels charged with memory. There is also a growing contrast between movement and stillness. When movement occurs, it feels more deliberate than before. When stillness occurs, it feels more loaded. Neither state is neutral anymore. Both carry implication. At this stage, the story begins to lean into a deeper idea, that survival itself changes meaning over time. At first, it is instinct. Later, it becomes habit. And eventually, it becomes identity. The protagonist no longer survives because he is reacting. He survives because that is what he is. This transformation is not stated directly, but it is felt through repetition, consistency, and tone. The absence of explanation becomes the explanation itself. Even secondary elements of the world begin to feel affected by this shift. Conversations that would normally exist in the background feel distant or reduced. Human presence feels less central, as if the world is gradually adjusting its focus around the lingering effect of what has already happened. And yet, nothing feels artificial. Everything remains grounded, restrained, and intentionally understated. That restraint is what maintains the emotional authenticity of the story. There is also a subtle sense that the narrative is beginning to close loops not through resolution, but through understanding. Earlier ideas return in quieter forms, not as repetition, but as reflection. Themes introduced in moments of intensity now reappear in calmer, more distilled versions. The result is a layered structure where meaning is built through contrast rather than explanation. High intensity gives way to silence. Chaos gives way to stillness. Action gives way to reflection. And through that progression, the emotional core becomes clearer. At this stage, Sisu 2 feels less like a traditional sequel and more like an extended meditation on endurance. Not endurance as a concept, but endurance as lived experience, something that cannot be separated from the character who embodies it. And as this part continues to unfold, the story begins preparing for its deeper transition into final thematic reflection, where everything that has been built will begin to converge into meaning rather than movement. At this stage of Sisu 2, the narrative begins to quietly converge, not through sudden events or dramatic escalation, but through the slow alignment of everything that has been building since the beginning. Every theme, survival, silence, endurance, consequence, starts to feel like it is moving toward a single shared understanding rather than separate ideas. It is no longer about what he might say. It is about what his silence represents consistently across every situation. That consistency becomes its own form of communication. There is also a subtle shift in emotional tone. Earlier sections of the story carried tension through unpredictability. Now, tension comes from inevitability. The sense that everything is moving toward a point that cannot be avoided, even if it is not explicitly defined. This inevitability does not feel negative. It feels structured, almost natural, as if the story is aligning itself with its own internal logic, rather than forcing external outcomes. The idea of legacy becomes even more abstract here. It is no longer tied to recognition, myth, or reputation. Instead, it becomes something embedded in the world itself. A kind of invisible imprint left behind through persistence and repetition. Even without direct confrontation, the influence of the protagonist continues to be felt indirectly. Not through presence, but through absence. Not through action, but through aftermath. This reversal deepens the narrative complexity without changing its tone. At this stage, Sisu 2 feels like it is operating on a final internal rhythm. Everything is aligned. Nothing feels random. Every element, even silence, feels intentional. And as this convergence continues, the story begins preparing for its final transition, not into resolution in a traditional sense, but into a state where meaning becomes fully visible through everything that has already occurred. At this stage of Sisu 2, the narrative reaches a point where everything begins to feel interconnected in a way that was always present, but not fully visible until now. Earlier moments that once felt separate, individual encounters, isolated environments, fragmented tension, now start to align into a single continuous thread. The story is no longer moving forward in a traditional sense. Instead, it feels like it is revealing how everything was already connected from the beginning. The structure becomes less about progression and more about revelation through reflection. The protagonist continues his path, but that path no longer feels like a sequence of decisions. It feels like a natural continuation of something already set in motion long before the audience became aware of it. There is a sense of inevitability, but not in a forced way, in a way that feels grounded in the internal logic of the world itself. At this point, even distance begins to feel symbolic. Physical space between events, between encounters, between moments of silence and action, starts to feel like emotional space. The larger the distance, the heavier the meaning behind it. The film uses that distance to emphasize not separation, but connection through contrast. The environment becomes increasingly reflective of the internal structure of the story. Empty landscapes no longer feel empty. They feel like memory without narration. Ruins no longer feel like destruction alone. They feel like evidence of continuity, proof that something has passed through and left its mark behind. There is also a growing awareness that the story is operating on multiple layers simultaneously. On the surface, it is still a survival-driven narrative. But underneath that surface, it has become something more abstract, a study of persistence, consequence, and identity stripped of explanation. The protagonist remains unchanged in form, but not in perception. The way he is understood shifts depending on context. To some parts of the world, he is still an unknown force. To others, he is already a legend shaped by incomplete understanding. This fragmentation of perception adds depth without needing additional exposition. What becomes increasingly important here is consistency, not in events, but in tone. The film maintains a steady emotional register that allows the audience to remain grounded even as the narrative becomes more abstract. That consistency is what keeps the experience cohesive. The pacing also continues its transformation. Earlier urgency has fully dissolved. What remains is a controlled, deliberate flow where even moments of movement feel calm in structure, if not in content. The difference between action and stillness becomes almost invisible. This blending of opposites, movement and pause, sound and silence, presence and absence, creates a unified rhythm that defines this stage of the story. It is no longer about contrast. It is about balance. There is also a subtle shift in how meaning is delivered. Instead of being built through events, meaning is now built through accumulation of feeling. Each moment adds a small layer to an emotional structure that cannot be separated into individual parts anymore. The protagonist's silence continues to function as a central element, but its effect has evolved. It no longer creates mystery or tension. Instead, it creates stability. It becomes the anchor point through which everything else is understood. Even the idea of survival begins to feel redefined. It is no longer reactive. It is not about escaping danger or overcoming obstacles in isolation. It becomes a continuous state of being, an ongoing condition rather than a response. As all of these layers begin to settle together, the narrative approaches a point of clarity that is not expressed through dialogue or explanation, but through cohesion. Everything feels like it belongs to the same internal system. At this stage, Sisu 2 is no longer building toward a traditional climax. It is moving toward understanding through convergence. Every thread is slowly aligning, not to end the story, but to reveal its shape in full. And in that alignment, the story prepares for its final transformation, not into conclusion, but into complete thematic visibility. At this point in Sisu 2, the story feels like it is no longer expanding outward, but folding inward. Every element that once appeared separate, conflict, silence, movement, consequence, now feels like it is part of a single continuous structure that has been forming since the very beginning. There is a noticeable shift in how the world behaves within the narrative. It no longer reacts in bursts or isolated moments. Instead, everything feels steady, almost synchronized, as if the environment itself has settled into the same rhythm that has defined the protagonist all along. This creates a strange kind of harmony between character and world, not through peace, but through consistency. The protagonist continues forward, but the meaning of forward has changed. It is no longer tied to direction or destination. It feels more like continuation without interruption. Each step is less about reaching something new and more about maintaining what already exists within him. At this stage, tension no longer depends on visible threats. It exists in expectation that never fully resolves. The audience has become aware that the story is not aiming to surprise anymore. It is aiming to complete a pattern that has been carefully built through repetition and variation. Even the concept of time feels altered. It no longer behaves like a sequence of moments. Instead, it feels layered. Past, present, and aftermath seem to exist simultaneously within the same emotional space. Earlier events do not feel behind the current narrative. They feel embedded within it. This layering creates a deeper sense of continuity. Nothing feels discarded or forgotten. Everything contributes to the current state of the story, even moments that seemed minor at first. That accumulation gives weight to even the simplest actions. The environment continues to reflect this internal structure. Spaces feel less like locations and more like states of memory. Every place carries a sense of having already been experienced, even if it is shown for the first time. This creates a subtle emotional familiarity that strengthens immersion. There is also a growing sense that the narrative is approaching a point where explanation becomes unnecessary. Not because clarity is missing, but because clarity has already been achieved through repetition and structure. The audience no longer needs to be guided. They are already aligned with the story's rhythm. The protagonist's silence now functions as complete communication. It no longer builds mystery or tension. It represents stability within a world that is constantly shifting around him. That stability becomes one of the strongest narrative forces remaining. As the structure continues to converge, contrasts begin to fade. Earlier distinctions between chaos and control, movement and stillness, survival and existence begin to blur. What remains is a unified tone that carries through every element of the story. This is where the film begins to feel less like a sequence of events and more like a sustained emotional state. It holds rather than progresses. It maintains rather than escalates. Even the idea of conflict becomes less central, not because it disappears, but because it no longer defines the narrative. It exists in the background, absorbed into the larger framework of endurance and continuity. At this stage, Sisu 2 feels like it is preparing to settle into its final form, not through resolution, but through full alignment of everything it has established. And that alignment brings the story closer to a state where nothing needs to change anymore, because everything has already been revealed through structure, tone, and repetition. The narrative is now standing at the edge of its final stillness. At this stage of Sisu 2, the narrative enters a phase where even the idea of progression begins to feel secondary. What was once a forward-moving story now feels like it is existing in a sustained moment, long, continuous, and deeply self-contained. The world no longer appears to shift in noticeable ways. Instead, it feels as though it has already completed its transformation earlier in the story, and now only the aftereffects remain. These aftereffects are not dramatic or sudden. They are slow, steady, and embedded into every visual and emotional layer of the experience. The protagonist continues his presence within this stillness, but even his movement feels almost symbolic at this point. It is no longer about reaching or escaping. It is about existing within the framework that has already been defined. His silence reinforces this feeling, acting less as a narrative tool and more as a constant state of being. There is a growing sense that everything the story intended to communicate has already been communicated, not through direct explanation, but through accumulation. Every moment before this has contributed to a complete emotional structure, and now that structure simply holds itself in place. Tension, in its traditional form, begins to dissolve here, not because stakes are removed, but because they have already been fully established. The audience no longer waits for something to happen. They observe the lingering presence of everything that already has. The environment reflects this fully stabilized state. It no longer feels reactive or dynamic. Instead, it feels settled, as if it has absorbed everything that occurred within it and is now resting in that accumulated weight. Even silence feels different here, less like absence and more like completion. At this point, contrast has almost entirely faded. The story no longer relies on opposites to define meaning. Instead, Meaning exists through continuity. Every element feels aligned with the same underlying tone, creating a unified emotional field rather than separate narrative components. The protagonist remains unchanged in appearance and action, but his presence carries a deeper sense of finality, not as an ending, but as completion of form. He no longer feels like a character moving through events, but like the final expression of everything the story has been building toward. Even perception within the story world becomes quieter. There are no longer strong shifts in how others respond or interpret him. Instead, there is a kind of fading acknowledgement, a recognition that does not need to be spoken or emphasized. It simply exists in the background of the narrative. The pacing here is extremely deliberate, not slow in a traditional cinematic sense, but fully controlled and stable. It feels like the story is holding itself in place, allowing every accumulated layer to remain visible at once without distraction. At this stage, Sisu 2 is no longer building toward meaning. It is resting within it. Everything that needed to be established has already been established. What remains is the experience of that establishment continuing without interruption. There is also a subtle sense that time itself has stopped behaving like a forward-moving line. Instead, it feels circular or layered, as if all moments now exist simultaneously within a single emotional structure. This gives the narrative a feeling of completeness without requiring closure. The protagonist's silence becomes absolute in effect, not because it increases, but because it no longer needs context. It simply is. And within that is, the entire tone of the story is contained. This is the final state before resolution, not an ending yet, but the final moment of stillness where everything is fully present at once. And within that stillness, the story prepares for its final transformation into complete emotional closure. At this point in Sisu 2, the narrative no longer feels like it is unfolding. It feels like it is simply existing in its final, fully formed state. There is no visible effort toward continuation or expansion. Instead, everything rests in a kind of quiet completion where meaning is already fully embedded in what has been shown. The world appears settled into its most final emotional shape. Not peaceful in a conventional sense, but stabilized. As if every action, every moment of silence, every consequence has already been absorbed into the environment itself. Nothing feels unresolved anymore, not because everything has been explained, but because everything has already been experienced. The protagonist continues to exist within this space, but his presence now feels almost indistinguishable from the atmosphere around him. He is no longer a separate force moving through the world. He feels integrated into it, as if the boundary between character and environment has softened into something unified. At this stage, movement itself loses urgency entirely. Even when he moves, it feels like continuation rather than direction. There is no tension behind it anymore. There is only consistency. That consistency is what carries the final emotional weight of the narrative. The story's earlier intensity now feels distant, not in importance, but in texture. It still exists in memory, but it no longer defines the present state of the film. Instead, it contributes to a layered understanding that has already been fully formed. Silence becomes the dominant emotional language here. Not silence as absence, but silence as completion. It holds everything together without needing reinforcement. It allows the entire narrative to remain present at once, without fragmentation. The environment reflects this final alignment. It does not change, react, or evolve anymore. Instead, it simply remains, fully shaped by everything that has passed through it. Even empty space feels meaningful, as if it has absorbed the weight of every earlier moment. There is also a final sense of emotional balance that emerges here. Not resolution in the traditional sense, but equilibrium. Everything that was once in motion now feels accounted for within the structure of the story. Nothing feels out of place, even without explanation. The protagonist's silence, which is carried through the entire narrative, now feels complete in function. It no longer builds tension, mystery, or anticipation. It simply confirms identity. It is the final, consistent expression of who he is within this world. At this point, the audience is no longer processing events. They are experiencing the totality of the story as a single emotional state. Individual scenes no longer stand alone. They merge into one continuous impression. That impression is steady, unbroken, and fully formed. There is also a subtle realization that the story has reached the edge of interpretation itself. Everything has already been shown, but not everything needs to be defined. Meaning is no longer being constructed, it is being recognized. This recognition is what gives the narrative its final depth. It allows the audience to arrive at understanding without being guided step by step. It feels natural, almost inevitable. At this stage, Sisu 2 is no longer building toward anything. It is simply holding its final form in place long enough to be fully absorbed. And in that holding, the entire experience becomes unified, past, present, and aftermath existing together in a single, quiet emotional structure. This is the final threshold before complete closure. At the final stage of Sisu 2, there is no longer a sense of narrative movement, only presence. Everything that was meant to be experienced has already unfolded, and what remains now is the pure after-state of that experience, quiet, complete, and fully absorbed into memory. The world no longer feels like it is holding a story. It feels like it has already lived through it. Every space carries that invisible residue of everything that passed through it, not as visible change, but as emotional imprint. Nothing needs to be added, because nothing feels missing. The protagonist remains within this final stillness, not as a figure moving through events, but as the final expression of continuity itself. His silence is no longer meaningful in the way it once was. It no longer builds tension or mystery. Instead, it has become the final confirmation of identity. Nothing about him needs to be explained anymore. At this point, even interpretation begins to settle. The audience is no longer searching for meaning. Meaning has already formed through accumulation, repetition, and experience. What remains is acceptance of what has been felt rather than analysis of what has been shown. There is a deep emotional calm that defines this final state. Not calm as an absence of intensity, but calm as in full saturation. Everything has already reached its peak, and now it simply exists in equilibrium. The story is no longer pushing forward or pulling back. It is resting in completion. The environment reflects this fully realized stillness. It does not change, but it does not feel static either. It feels complete, as if every element within it understands its place within the larger structure of what has occurred. Even silence here feels different from earlier parts of the narrative. It is no longer a tool used for tension or anticipation. It is the natural state of the world after everything has been said without words. The idea of legacy, which has slowly evolved across the entire structure of the story, now exists entirely outside the film itself. It belongs to the audience. It exists in memory, in reflection, in the way the experience continues to live after it ends. That is where its true continuation lies, not in sequels or extensions, but in remembrance. The protagonist no longer represents a journey. He represents endurance as a completed idea, not something in progress, but something fully expressed. That expression does not require continuation because it has already achieved its form. At this final moment, Sisu 2 no longer feels like a story that ended. It feels like a story that fully arrived at what it was always meant to be. And because of that, there is nothing left to conclude in the traditional sense. No final twist, no final explanation, no final resolution that needs to be stated. Only the lasting impression remains. A quiet understanding, a steady emotional echo, a sense of something unbreakable that was witnessed rather than told. And even when everything fades completely from view, that echo does not disappear. It continues, silently, steadily, and without needing recognition. Because some stories don't end when they are finished. They end when they are understood.